Good segue. I think, yeah, we're rolling, guys. So whenever you guys are ready to hop in.
Erica, welcome back to A Road
Thank
Less
you.
Traveled podcast on our Historical Women series, talking about the women who paved a road less traveled.
Excellent. Well,
Please clue me in. Who are we talking about today?
we're talking about Elizabeth Kortright Monroe. And as I had alluded to, Monroe should clue a few people in. Uh, so for those of us who need a refresher, just early American history, presidents were George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and then James Monroe. So we're
So
actually
I was going the Marilyn Monroe route. So we're talking a
little
little before that.
different century, yeah.
Gotcha.
But you're right. Technically, Monroe was the name used for both. Yeah.
All right.
Um, so we're talking about the first ladies today.
Okay.
And we're talking about, well, we're going to wind up inadvertently talking about some of the other first ladies and prominent women in DC at the time.
Okay.
But we're talking about Elizabeth Kortright Monroe because she is one of the least written about first ladies in American history. And
Okay. My first question is why?
well, when was she was ill for a large part of her life, and so
Okay.
she died relatively young, 50s, I think, like not young, but middle aged.
But like for
And when
today's
she
reference, that's super freaking young.
it is, and when she was ill and she was going to die, she asked her husband, "When I die, please burn my papers, burn all my personal papers."
Ugh.
So there are
Well, to be fair, I've asked you to burn my journals when I die. So
you have and I can see why. But there are literally two letters left written in her own hand that she had mailed to somebody and that got kept.
okay.
And what's the difference is, right? So you and I write a journal, write a blog, write a whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and we write them as a catharsis.
Mm-hmm.
She was part of a generation where the men in particular knew the role they were going to have in history and were super obsessed with it. I know we've briefly mentioned Hamilton before.
Mm-hmm.
But think about the way Alexander Hamilton is portrayed, right? Like you're running out of time. How will the history will know my story? How will they talk about me? All of the founders were obsessed with it.
Yes.
And Thomas Jefferson was James Monroe's mentor. And so
Okay.
this woman was married to a man who sort of was of the same ethos of like, what I do, what I say is going to be important. All of this stuff is groundbreaking. And yet, knowing she was a political wife, she was still like, I don't think so. Go ahead and burn it.
And do you think that that is related to? Do you think that that was related to the gender roles at the time, where she was like, "I know that this is all going to be important, but I'm still a woman, and I would hate to have this, that, the other thing out there."
I don't think we know her well enough to say that.
Okay.
What we do know about her, and this is something I've kind of alluded to when you've asked before, like how do we learn more about Bertha Benz?
Mm-hmm.
How do we learn more about women whose stories haven't been told?
Mm-hmm.
The way we do it is we look at the women around them. Well, we look at the world around them. But I think in this case, Washington, D.C. was just becoming the Washington we know it to be.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of having a social life, the idea of the president having social obligations was really in its infancy from 1800-ish to like 1830. So the Jefferson administration, Madison administration, and then Monroe, where Elizabeth was the first lady. Jefferson didn't have a first lady, so he did all his hosting himself.
Mm-hmm.
Dolly Madison kind of took what Jefferson did and ran with it.
Mm-hmm.
And then Elizabeth Kortright Monroe kind of scaled it back and she made it a little more European.
Okay.
And women talked about her. They wrote letters to each other. They wrote in their diaries. They published little snippy newspaper, page 6 kind of like the first lady today or Mrs. Monroe today, like little snippy things.
Kind of catty.
And kind of catty. They really were. And she doesn't even have her own full-length biography is how little we know about her. But we know what people thought about her.
Okay.
So one guess as to maybe why she wanted those papers burned was other people didn't think kindly of her. And she didn't want that sort of dirty laundry aired in public. It could also be that she was just very private and she didn't want to be the story. She couldn't change that she was married to a president, but she could change how much they got to know about her.
I mean, yet here we are today. Like, let's talk about
Let's
her.
talk about her.
So she is now a first lady, and she's in the White House, and she's hosting. And you're saying she's making it a little more European.
I lost you.
Are we talking like tiny dishes, or are we like?
You're totally frozen.
Oh, am I still frozen?
Okay, you totally froze.
Am I
No,
unfrozen?
your face is, but I can hear you. You're unfrozen.
Okay.
I heard she is now.
So
And
she's
that's the last thing
now
I
a
heard.
first lady. And she
Yep.
will be hosting, doing the social thing. And you're saying she's making it a little more European, which is maybe a little bit of a change up from what was going on prior. Does that mean she's
Right.
like scaling down the portions of their food, or is she changing what's offered? Is she changing who's invited? What is she doing that's upsetting people?
Okay, so keep in mind, they're all figuring this out as they go. This idea of the presidency itself,
We're
let
all
alone
still figuring this out as we
we're
go. Oh,
we are. But the White House now has a chief of protocol. It has a social secretary. None of that existed. It was Jefferson in his house.
Mm-hmm.
That was the White House. Jefferson in the building with like some enslaved folks and a secretary, Meriwether Lewis, who later went on Lewis and Clark. So that's Jefferson in 1800. By the time the Monroes get there in 1820, it's still mainly just a big house. Like offices don't exist. The West Wing doesn't exist. The Oval Office was Meriwether Lewis's bedroom from 1800 to 1803.
Okay. So just very different than the way that the presidency is now in general.
Exactly. So they're trying to figure it out. And Jefferson started, I know we kind of have to get at Elizabeth, we got to go back a little again, looking at the people and things around her. Jefferson had started to establish dining and entertaining that took what he thought was very important from European dining. So the types of foods, the way things were served, and then added what he called a Republican nature. So things that would be more egalitarian and equitable and more in line with the revolutionary generation. And Dolly took that more equitable to mean a lot of access to Dolly as a first lady. Okay. She held these open houses and anyone could walk in and talk to her. Elizabeth Kortright Monroe got rid of some of those things that made her accessible to the people, right? She created boundaries and brought back some of the more formal settings of European dining that Dolly Madison had kind of done away with. In trying to be a woman of the people, Dolly Madison said, "You have full access to me. We're going to make everything equitable. You know, this is America." And so when she scaled back access to her person and to the interior of the White House, which they were already calling the people's house. At the time, they called it the president's house. The White House as a term caught on later, but for our purposes, the White House. Women were really, really annoyed because part of your status was to say, I had lunch with the first lady. I had tea with the first lady. You know, I met these other famous, fabulous women, all of the above, with the first lady. And Elizabeth really limited that access to herself. And it ticked women off. Shocker.
Yeah. Well, it wouldn't tick anybody off if you stop having access to the things that gave you status.
Right. Exactly. And so why I like talking about Elizabeth Kortright Monroe is what we do know about her is that people were kind of catty about her. And I think the word I've heard the most is she was an enigmatic first lady.
Okay. For the layman, what does enigmatic mean?
Enigmatic means hard to pin down, mysterious. Okay. We don't have a lot of info.
Like the word enigmatic itself.
Correct.
Mysterious.
Exactly.
Nobody knows what it means.
It's just not true. But what we've done is we've taken what these other ladies publicly or privately said. So another fun fact, if I wrote a letter to you, more in the early 1800s, I know that there's a good chance you're going to give that letter to a friend or read that letter to your family. Oh, I got news from cousin Erika and fill in the blank. She has news about this and that.
Yeah.
Letters weren't private the way we really think of privacy.
Mhm.
And there were obviously times where they were, and there were phrases you could say that, like, I'll tell you in the strictest confidence, which really means this letter isn't for public consumption.
Mhm.
But a lot of them were. So these kind of private public letters that denigrated or talked down on Elizabeth Kortright Monroe were what became her reputation.
Kind of like Twitter for the time. Twitter doesn't exist.
Very
Sorry about that.
same concept, right?
Yeah.
Somebody is going to say something and it's going to get shared.
Okay.
Just not as quickly. What's really cool is she had some really interesting firsts.
Mhm.
So, for instance, the first presidential China pattern.
Oh, I love presidential.
Yeah. So as I understand it, it is all located in Virginia, not in DC, because the China room in the White House has a selection from, the stretch of it. But as I understand it, most of it is at his home James
Hold on.
Monroe's home in Virginia.
All we have has a selection.
China room in the White House has a selection of China dating back quite a ways for the presidents. But as I understand it, most or all of the Monroe's presidential China is at his home. It's called Highland. It's in Virginia, and it's only 2 miles from Thomas Jefferson's home, Monticello. Like, this is how much Monroe appreciated his tutelage and mentorship with Jefferson, is that he did buy property very close to him.
Oh, wow.
And there's now a museum there, and it's run by the College of William and Mary, which is kind of one of those seminal institutions if you want to study the early republic. Like, they've got the most scholars and sort of the best grip on it.
Okay.
So she did things that were really important. And I think even toning down Dolly Madison and setting some standards, because public and private life are different. We all know that. We also accept if you've decided to be in the public eye, there's going to be less privacy.
Right.
But she was really trying to create where's the boundary of that for presidents and for first ladies.
Boundaries are uncomfortable for people. People don't like boundaries.
They are, and they don't. And so it was a real shift. The other thing is she was often ill. And so she didn't have the stamina to do the kind of 2 or 3 times a week entertaining that Dolly Madison was doing.
That actually was a full circle moment for me when you said she was ill. Like, oh yeah, well, duh, that would make sense why she didn't want to do these other things and doesn't have the energy, doesn't have the patience, doesn't
exactly.
have the stamina.
If we go back, we know more about her before, like, in my opinion, I think the information about her in Europe is actually a little bit more thorough than the information we have in DC.
Okay.
She was in Europe twice. James Monroe was appointed ambassador to France in, I think it was 1794, so under George Washington.
Okay.
And then Thomas Jefferson, when he took office, appointed him again as ambassador to France. And he was one of the folks who helped broker the Louisiana Purchase.
So they lived
in France.
Okay.
Each 6 years the first time, and I think 4 the second, something like that. And the first time they went in the 1790s, they put their daughter in school. And their daughter became friends with a little girl named Hortense. And Hortense's mommy, Josephine, married Napoleon Bonaparte.
Oh, okay, I'm here.
It gets better. As I understand it, I would, if you can fact check me, somebody, but this is one of the things I've researched quite a bit. The Monroe family were the only Americans at Napoleon's coronation when he crowned himself emperor.
Interesting.
So I say this because
I have to say that in the timeline of history in my mind, these two things aren't coexisting, right? Like, Napoleon seems like such a far off concept to when the United States was, founded and functioning in its early years. Like, they seem so.
And they overlapped. And you forget the French Revolution. Thomas Jefferson is the only American who was in America during the American Revolution and in France during the Reign of Terror. Well, there might have been others, but he's the most famous.
Yeah.
So he lived through both of the revolutions, which is crazy, like was in them. But the point with Elizabeth Kortright is, or Monroe, Elizabeth Kortright Monroe, Kortright's her maiden name, is that she was very well received in Europe.
Okay.
And
Well,
she
yes, because
moved,
boundaries and leave me alone and let's be quiet.
yes, but also the slightly more formal
Mhm.
proceedings, right? And they called her La Belle Américaine, which just the
Ooh.
beautiful American. And she was charming. And this is where, as a wife and hostess, she
Mhm.
really learned to hold court, right? To host events, to be sort of the manager of her own space.
So this
And I
is
mean
like
that,
where she thrived, and that got
yeah,
translated to her white White House in our terms.
right,
Okay. Okay.
exactly. And so she took what she had known and what she'd really perfected and brought it to the White House, particularly as she was ill
Mhm.
fairly regularly by the time she was in the White House. It was, again, she was later in her marriage.
What was she ill with?
We don't know. Everyone just says ill. Interestingly, on one of my research trips last year, I got to go to Highland, Monroe's
Mhm.
home, and got to speak with some of these folks from William and Mary. And then I went to the University of Virginia in the same town and did some archival research.
Mhm.
And I found a couple of letters where James Monroe and James Madison, so the
Okay.
president and the former president,
Mhm.
were writing each other. And James Madison says, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I missed Mrs. Monroe. She was ill again and couldn't see us." And so it was kind of fun as a like independent student researcher
Yeah.
reaching back out and saying, "Hey, I found this letter. I don't know if you guys know it exists. I'm going to shoot you over, the picture PDF that I took of it."
Uh-huh.
Because all of those little moments, that tells us we knew that date, that month, that whatever. It's one of the
Mhm.
times she was sick and therefore not in Washington.
Yeah.
So these letters have these little tidbits, as I kind of mentioned with Bertha and other talks we've had about archives. It doesn't it says as much about her as it doesn't say about her.
Right.
And we can almost piecework it back together like a quilt
Mhm.
using all of these other sources about her.
It's very interesting. I especially like the cadence in which she was ill, or those things can give us a
Yeah,
better idea of what she might have been suffering with, or anyway, that's a tangent.
exactly.
I'm back.
But that's okay. But those are the kinds of questions we ask. Will we ever be able to answer that? Probably not. It could have been something like lupus, something
Mhm.
that was a chronic illness. It could have been that she got cancer and it just was a long, slow, and we didn't, there's no way to know, but they're questions that should still be asked, right? There's still validity in asking the question because it means we're going to look for an answer, which
Mhm.
means we're going to learn something, even if we don't learn what we hope to learn.
Completely.
Yeah. So, yeah. So I just think she's a really interesting figure because she made James Monroe, who was our fifth president, if I can count correctly, um, a political success
Mhm.
from behind the scenes while she was facing sort of the displeasure of the women of Washington society. Even when she wasn't in town, she was very much a emotional and moral support for James via letters and such.
So were there women that did like her? Is there documentation of like her friends, or people that stayed close, and I guess that she felt safe with, to use kind of more of a modern spin on it?
Yeah, there were letters from different women in Washington society who speak fondly of her, and by fondly I mean more like, Mrs. Monroe stopped by today. She was dressed beautifully. And
Okay.
that's all it will say.
Mhm.
Versus Mrs. Monroe has done away with the Wednesday night levies and we're all so upset, right? Like, so you'll see these little snippets of things that are complimentary.
Mhm.
And that seems to be a recurring theme, is that she really was quite lovely,
Mhm.
which is great. But again, when we
Lovely.
talk about
Define lovely. She was lovely in the physically
physically
beautiful.
attractive,
Yeah, physically beautiful sense.
la belle américaine.
Yeah.
So when we do hear about her descriptions from other women, even they are talking about her beauty, which,
Mhm.
again, going back to, let's talk about how we discuss women today. we still are more likely to have a conversation about their attractiveness or lack of attractiveness before we have a conversation about their skills, qualifications, and talents.
That's true.
Um,
It's really super duper sad.
it is super duper sad and it's super duper frustrating because these are women who are making specific contributions
Mhm.
that even the other women who, again, everyone kind of knows that they're starting something new with this Washington, D.C. society.
Mhm.
They know they're starting something new and they're still kind of throwing shade.
Well, they're trying to
And it,
remain relevant, right?
yeah,
Staying in the spotlight or making some sort of statement, staying relevant, staying in the news. I mean, we see it today
yeah,
too.
it's true. And I had never thought of it like that. I'd always thought of it as Dolly Madison set a really high bar with being very, like she was just emotionally an open person,
Mhm.
and her open houses were open, where I keep using the word open,
Yeah.
right? When she'd have these dinners or parties, they were accessible to the public. The public
Mhm.
could walk in. So it was a level of accessibility that
Mhm.
even today we're like, oh, that's maybe too much.
Mhm.
And it became a really hard act to follow. But it, in some ways, turned out to be good because her successor was Louisa Catherine Adams.
Mhm.
Louisa Catherine Adams was married to John Quincy Adams, who was son of John Adams, the second president.
Mhm.
And Louisa Catherine Adams had also traveled extensively in Europe, which Dolly hadn't had quite as much traveling in Europe.
Mhm.
And so she saw what happened to Elizabeth Kortright Monroe and went, ooh, I bet I could change some things up
Mhm.
and find a happy medium between Dolly Madison's like free for all and the sort of strict boundaries that Elizabeth Kortright Monroe set up.
Between totally open
And
and totally closed.
right. And I have actually, Louisa Catherine Adams did write everything down. And we do have extensive information from her. And over my shoulder, one of my shoulders, oh, right there, those two, those are her complete diary published.
Okay.
So I have read her words.
Oh my
And
God,
she
please
is,
don't do that to me if I kick the bucket before you.
I will not. I will not publish them, bind them, and have Yale University put them in print. But she is one of the people who speaks most kindly about Elizabeth. And it's because she already knows her husband's going to run for president. She
Mhm.
expects to be first lady. And we're talking 1 or 2 years into Elizabeth's shot at first lady. So she is, and she's writing about it. She's like, I expect to avoid this. I expect to do this. I understand, this is such a struggle for Mrs. Monroe. And I bet I can avoid it. And I'm like, what the? Like she was as politically minded as her husband.
So she set those are the published journals. I'm interested in the unpublished journals, the one where you write your feelings, not the one where
Right?
you curate your future, essentially.
Yeah. Well, and the interesting thing is when we talk about these curated manuscripts, it's a combination of the person who wrote them curating them,
Mhm.
their family and friends curating them, and then publishers.
Yeah.
So there's like 3 levels that have sort of filtered things out.
Mhm.
And with Jefferson in particular, in his later years, he had like a cult following in popular culture and was able to really get this amazing good press
Mhm.
and people writing newspaper articles about him later in life and people writing biographies about him in his own life that he got a say in. So a lot of, again, when we talk about these mythologized figures in American
Yeah.
history, they helped curate their own mythology.
They get to write their own story, essentially.
Yeah, for a lot of them.
So I'm going to take a little bit of a left turn here and say,
Do it.
why are we Dolly Madison, first, last, and then Elizabeth Kortright Monroe? So why is her maiden name relevant and Dolly Madison's is not?
Dolly Madison is her married name.
Right. That's
she
my
was
question.
Dolly.
What's her maiden name?
So Dolly Madison's maiden name was, it was Dolly Payne Todd. So she was Dolly Payne, then she married a man named Todd, and then she married Madison. So
I
Dolly
see why
Payne.
hers are now
Yeah.
not. I see why her maiden name.
She was married several times. She was in America. She did not travel to Europe because she had this first husband.
Yeah.
So the little traveling Madison did was before he married Mrs. Madison. But the other thing is Kortright. So I keep saying Elizabeth Kortright or Elizabeth Kortright Monroe was a very prominent New York family. So she was also a Yankee who married a Virginian. And this was during what we call the Virginia dynasty. And the Virginia dynasty is it's Washington minus John Adams, but Washington to Monroe, 4 of the first 5 presidents were Virginians.
Okay.
And that meant that a lot of their policies were pro-Virginia and pro-agriculture and pro the important things in the state of Virginia, rather than, and they were worried about the whole country,
right?
But it was called the Virginia dynasty. And so I think that's another reason that Elizabeth Kortright struggled, is not only was her ideas, not only were they very European, she was from New York. And while there were plenty of people from the northern states, she married a Virginian. She should get on board. Dolly Payne got on board. Dolly Payne Madison got on board.
That makes sense. I was just curious why her maiden name is thrown in there so much. Like, what was its relevance?
I think that was why. I think the other thing is she had a daughter named Elizabeth Monroe. They called her Eliza, and she did wind up marrying someone, I think, in New York when she was older. But I think one of them is to distinguish the mother from the daughter.
Okay.
And the other one is you see it more with with prominent families. Their name is, they continue to use the name and speak the name. Whereas Dolly Madison, her identity very much became the wife of James Madison.
I find it interesting that I don't hear often about women, having kind of a junior, which that's not quite a junior.
Yeah.
It's not exact, but I actually love that, that they named the daughter after the wife.
They did, and it was
the daughter
more common.
Involved much? Like, was she?
By the time they got to the White House, the daughter was married and had moved on, but her mother, when she was ill, would regularly go and stay with her.
Okay.
So we know that she was, I believe she did go to the White House once or twice, to be with her father when he entertained. Where we really see that, though, is with Jefferson. He was a widower, and his daughter, Martha, would come from Monticello. It was I think it was an 8-hour carriage ride. And she would stay for a couple of months and act as his hostess. So when he was having these more social gatherings rather than political kind of gatherings, she would act as his hostess and be his date for the night.
I'm staying for a couple of months and being a hostess. I'm not.
Correct. And so we do see the presidential children do play a role in the early years. James Madison never had children. Dolly Madison, when she was married before, had a son. And he actually, after James Madison died, Dolly Madison moved back to Washington, D.C., and she lived out her last years in a townhouse in D.C.
Interesting.
And her son was like the bane of her existence. He only showed up to ask for money, and he had a bad reputation in town as being sort of a loser who couldn't really ever get a job. And his big claim to fame was, my stepdad was the president.
So she had like sympathizers then too, which is maybe why people liked her more.
And that definitely could have been part of it. And it only takes one moment of bad press to kind of have that replicated. But the European nature of Elizabeth Monroe's hostessing was something Jefferson faced backlash for. And he just didn't care. And he was a man. And so he could say, but this is how I'm going to do it. Sorry, you don't like this part. Because he did use little bit. Like, he only served French wine. And he was famous for serving French champagne in a time when he had to bottle and import it himself from France. When the tax collector came around to tax him on his wine collection, they had to consult him. Nobody in America was skilled enough to actually evaluate the price of the wine that he had in his cellars.
Well, that's a whole nother conversation. But that's
So
really
like
interesting
so
tidbit.
many. Yeah.
So what was different about, so I asked this before and I'm just trying to kind of put a pin in it. Her
Yeah.
hosting style was different with the access to her and that kind of stuff. What
Yeah.
other types of like European influences would have been harshly judged?
Clothing was one of them. Again, Jefferson was very relaxed and laid back. He would wear linen or cotton kind of coats rather than a silk night coat.
Mm-hmm.
We saw it's called broadcloth.
Okay.
We saw Dolly do a combination.
Mm-hmm.
She obviously had silk gowns, but she, for a lot of her sort of weekly things, she would be a little dressed down.
Okay.
And again, the men were not wearing silk or satin coats, which was European. Whenever Elizabeth hosted or went out, she tended to be in very formal attire. And if you think of clothing like armor, right? Like when you wear a suit versus when you wear your sweats,
Yeah.
it sends a different message. And I think it added to the fact that she wasn't, that she was maybe a little standoffish and cold and not accessible. And we even see one of her portraits where she has, it's called ermine, that white fur that has the black spots. It's called ermine. It's a type of delightfully soft, fluffy rodent. And it's associated in Europe and England with royalty.
It's what's
and
on
so she
like,
has
the
one of,
brim of.
exactly.
Okay.
And one of her formal portraits, she's wearing an ermine cloak.
Interesting.
And so it literal symbols of royalty, which Jefferson had said, "Oh, we're a Republican nation. We must do away with this." And she's like, "But I learned this in France, and I'm really good at it, and this is who I am." So I think that was part of it. I also think she had more formal sit-down dinners and less of the kind of open house, come in, eat from the buffet, have a drink and leave. And she limited the guest list. She would have much smaller events rather than some of these events. And it's so funny. Okay, I'm a dork. I was going through looking for notes for today and found one of my old papers about Dolly Madison's hosting.
I love it.
But Dolly Madison would have these parties that had 200 people on a Wednesday night to come eat at the buffet and drink a glass of punch.
But
And
this is something that I find like
Elizabeth wasn't going to do
endlessly
that.
interesting as it relates to today. Did I lose you?
You're frozen.
Okay. Am I unfrozen? Because you froze too.
You did.
Am I unfrozen?
You're unfrozen now.
Okay. So this is something that
You're unfrozen now.
Are you sure?
Did I freeze again?
No, you just repeated the same thing twice. So here's something
that wasn't me.
I find endlessly interesting. So we, even in our discussion today, and the way that people viewed her, having boundaries or being too put together, too quiet, or having a certain affect, she is labeled as, cold, or, I'm summarizing, cold, bitchy, snobby, whatever.
Yep.
When perhaps she was just more quiet, or didn't have the energy, or was just a more reserved person in general. I still, to this day, and even in the way that we're addressed now, I can't stand if somebody tells me to smile. Like that makes my skin crawl. But I think that in other side of the same coin is she was labeled a lot of these things, even if she was an incredibly kind person,
right?
Just because of the nature of her being. She's got a lot of these labels, and now we don't know because she had everything burned.
Right. Well, and this is actually where I did my review for today, along with my archival research review, my notes review. And this is like a little pamphlet, and it was published by James Monroe's Highland, by the folks at William and Mary. And it's maybe 30 or 40 pages, and it's really an overview. And most of the primary sources are other people's words. But there's an entire page that talks about just quotes from James Monroe about his wife, right? She was the companion of his youth, the solace of his declining years, this world of care. And we know, right? We know that she was those things. She was an amazing partner and political spouse. And that's not the story.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, some of it perhaps to her own fault, but we're not Madison, Monroe, right? The husband and the president
Mm-hmm.
should maybe be a better, like, why aren't we listening to him? Why aren't we looking at him? Why aren't we
Yeah.
listening to what he says when her reputation, the number of times I've read, because there'll be a book, it'll be like the first ladies, and it'll start with Martha Washington and then Abigail Adams and then Dolly Madison. And then it'll be like Elizabeth Kortright Monroe was enigmatic. Elizabeth Kortright Monroe was reserved. And like
Mm-hmm.
it's the same paragraph just reformatted in every single one of these biographies. And it's like you could have gone to James Monroe's papers and said,
Mm-hmm.
we know this woman to be caring. Her husband, who we all say is important because he was a white president, says she was caring. But no, we're going to call her mysterious and enigmatic.
Interesting. I think that's an
Because that's her
interesting.
reputation.
Well, and that's, that's how we memorialized it or sensationalized it, when it
Yep.
seems like truly she was, in the time, your role as a wife was a lot of the definition of your being, if you will. Maybe we
Yeah.
don't view it the same way today, but she was doing all the right things, and still she has this reputation just because she has a little resting bitch face. I mean, that bothers me.
Yeah, it does. And like, again, this was sort of, and there will be other pictures throughout, but this is one of the like, this is what beauty looked like. And to me, it isn't what we call beauty.
Right.
Everyone said she was beautiful. That's all we talk about with her. And it cracks me up. Like, she was pretty and quiet, and we don't know anything about her.
And thus she is a bitch.
Yes.
I mean, that's
very much so.
Summarizing.
It is.
I don't think that. I'm just saying that seems to be the way that she has been documented.
Yes. And the other thing is, again, we get to this question of like, does reality, how much does reality matter if reputation, or if the public facing is all that we know, right?
Mm-hmm.
Does it really matter if I cheated on a test, if everyone thinks I cheated on a test? It's still going to ruin my reputation in academia.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality of it isn't important. So I think that has kind of happened to her too. The reality of her true nature was overshadowed by the women who spoke about her and the reputation that was repeated from Washington society.
Interesting. So the way she was sensationalized was just
Mm-hmm.
negative.
Yeah. And there's just a lot more to her, and I'm hoping that this is one of the projects that I can dig more into in my own research, because I think there's an argument to be made, to be just slightly technical for 30 seconds. Part of this idea of public history that we've talked about in previous podcasts is more digital work.
Uh-huh.
And there's this thing in digital humanities called network mapping. And it's like, if you and I send text to each other, who do you send text to? So if you're sending text to Barack Obama and I'm sending text to you, right? I'm only 1 degree of separation. Yes. And we can do that with letters and try to figure out, almost again, fill in the negative space that we don't know about her by looking at all these letters and connecting them.
Mm-hmm. And then you can see like who was really influential in society.
And not only who was influential, but kind of whose words wound up being the most effective in this case, right? Like who was saying what about her specifically? Because there were lots of women. There's one woman named Margaret Baird Smith who was incredibly influential. Mm-hmm. She wrote some of the biographies on Jefferson and in Jefferson's lifetime as a woman, and published them in the newspaper. So we know she's incredibly influential, but how much influence did she have specifically on Elizabeth's reputation?
Interesting.
So I'm intrigued with new ways for us as historians, for us as people, to look at women and to look at their contributions, even when there's nothing to see, or we think there's nothing to see.
That is an exciting thing for us to revisit.
It is, and I can't wait to talk to you about it.
Specifically in regards to Elizabeth Kortright Monroe.
Or any of the other women, Bertha Benz, right? Pocahontas, which we will likely never find anything because the written record doesn't exist. But any of the other women we ever talk about would be amazing to do this kind of work with.
Well, I'm excited to see where we go next with it.
Me
Thank you
too.
for your time. And I a lot of this stuff I didn't know at all. So it's really interesting to hear about the way that perception plays a role and the way that it plays a role in recorded history. So thank you so
Yeah.
much for all of your research, and I look forward to talking to you soon.
Awesome. You too. Can't wait till the next installment.
Thank you.
Awesome. And that's cut.